Caregiving can sometimes feel like an impossible struggle. Caregivers may be torn between taking care of loved ones and trying to maintain balance in life. The good news is that it doesn't have to be that way. The Caring Generation with host Pamela D Wilson is here to focus on the conversation of caring. You're not alone. In fact, you're in exactly the right place to share stories and learn tips and resources to help you and your loved ones. So now, please welcome the host of The Caring Generation, Pamela D Wilson.
This is Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, speaker, consultant, and guardian of the Caring Generation. The Caring Generation focuses on the conversation of caring, giving us permission to talk about aging, the challenges of caregiving, and everything in between. It's no surprise that needing care or becoming a caregiver changes everything. The Caring Generation is here to guide you along the journey to let you know that you're not alone. You are in exactly the right place to share stories, learn about caregiving programs and resources to help you and your loved ones plan for what's ahead. Invite your aging parents, spouses, family, and friends to listen to the program. If you have a question or an idea for a future show, share your idea with me by responding to my social media posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Today we are talking about situations that come about when elderly parents won't listen. Caregivers trying to be helpful can become frustrated with others who refuse to listen or act on the advice they give. I want to look at advising from two perspectives. The first is the idea of providing unsolicited advice tied to motivation. Then, what might not be considered when giving advice if you don't fully realize what it takes to do what you recommend or understand the unintended consequences of actually implementing the recommendation. The second part of this is where caregivers and most people run into trouble. First, you give advice, and then you feel insulted or angry when other people do not value the information you offer, or elderly parents or a spouse refuse to follow your advice. It's almost as if you feel insulted. So let's start with questions to ask yourself about giving advice. Under what circumstances do you give advice? How often do you give advice? Is it every day or weekly? Maybe once a month? Do you give advice only when people ask? Or do you find yourself compelled to constantly tell other people what you think, even when they don't ask? You might be wondering if I ask myself these questions since I essentially provide education and give advice to family caregivers and aging adults. All of these podcasts, the videos, the articles, and the content I create for my website, PamelaDWilson.com, respond to questions caregivers ask. In doing this, I do my best to be balanced and give the pros and cons of situations, and more importantly, the consequences of taking action or not acting. Because whether you believe it or not, everyone has a choice. Sometimes you just don't realize that you have a choice. So let's start with the first consideration of when elderly parents won't listen. If you are an adult child trying to get your parent to do something, they may be suspicious of your intentions. Think about your motivation and why you want a parent or a spouse to do something. Does the advice and their action benefit you, them, or is it mutually beneficial? Here's an example from my own life. After my mother died, my sister attempted to convince my father to sell his home and move into an apartment complex down the street from her house. My father resisted. And why wouldn't he? He lived in the same house for almost 70 years. He knew the neighborhood, the neighbors, He had a garden where he spent most of his time when the weather was nice. Moving into a one-bedroom apartment with a balcony had no appeal, so we didn't move. The motivation for my sister was that it would have been more convenient for her if Dad was nearby in case something happened. Now, my dad's house was on my sister's way to work, so it may have only taken her another 10 minutes to make that detour, and I'm sure there were days when she didn't want to do it. But it really was my dad's desire to continue to live in the family home. And at the time all of this was going on, my father was still able to take care of himself. He took his medication, still drove his car, and he was in pretty good physical condition for his age, although he had arthritis and a few aches and pains. But overall, he was self-sufficient. There was no memory loss going on. My sister helped with things like, reordering his prescriptions and setting up med boxes, going with him to doctor appointments, and making sure that he was socially engaged. My father was lucky. At the time of his death, he was still living in that family home. But I realized that this is not the situation for many parents or spouses with significant health issues who need care from family members 20, 30, 40, or more hours a week. In this situation, family caregivers who feel burdened may suggest or advise loved ones that it's time to accept caregivers in the home or move to a care home, assisted living, or even memory care if mom, dad, or a spouse has dementia or Alzheimer's disease and are not safe to live at home alone. Accepting help in the home or moving out of a family home is a significant change for a parent. Just like it would have been for my father, who lived in his house for many years. Many of your parents have lived in the same house for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Now, if a parent has not remained socially active, add to this, there may be fear of moving to a community where there are a bunch of strangers. Plus, then, the obvious. The idea of cleaning out the house may be too overwhelming. You know how things collect in attics and basements and closets, and if you don't keep up with it, you have quite a collection. I'll share some thoughts on having and succeeding with this moving conversation in the second half of the program when we talk about solutions. Number 2 for when elderly parents won't listen is the absence of seeing or understanding the benefit of change, assuming that this is the advice. Let's relate this to a doctor appointment recommending that a parent take medications, avoid foods high in cholesterol, or participate in physical therapy exercises. One or all of these recommendations may receive a big no from mom or dad, especially if your parent is not interested in the why they should do any of this. Now, they may not have asked questions to understand the benefit or the reasons or consequences of doing or not doing all or one of these things. They may have felt rushed at the doctor appointment. In that case, what can you, as the caregiver, do to support the change? Can you pick up and set out a medication box? Are you in a position to walk with your parent every day or hire someone to do this? The same goes for physical therapy exercises. In this case, the way it works is the doctor writes an order that goes to a home health company, and a physical therapist will come to the house to evaluate your parent's physical abilities. If mom or dad is a fall risk, balance exercises might be recommended by the physical therapist, or exercises to strengthen the arms or legs. The challenge is that the physical therapist doesn't come to the home every day and not forever. The idea is to show mom, dad, or a spouse how to do the exercises with the goal that these exercises will be continued long after that physical therapist stops coming to the home. So what can you do as a caregiver? What about learning the exercises? Doing them with your loved one every time you visit or every day? What about creating a calendar schedule for your parent to do the exercises and check them off that they have been completed? How often is there this initial motivation to do something, And then a distraction or a barrier happens and that activity ends. For example, maybe you started a project around the house or the yard and other priorities took over. Or you realized, wow, this project, it is going to take a lot more time and effort than I initially expected, and I don't know that I want to do this anymore. Underestimating the time or effort it takes to change a habit or complete tasks frequently happens in caregiving situations because of a lack of prior experience in many of these tasks or interactions. You don't know what it takes. You don't know the effort that it takes. So thinking about health, changing eating habits or a diet can be challenging. You would know this if you've tried. A parent simply may not see the benefit of reducing their cholesterol so that they don't have greater heart disease or a heart attack or a stroke. To do that, you got to start looking at food labels, and that can be a hassle if you don't even know what you're looking for. You may have to change the way that you cook. You may have all this food in your house that you can no longer eat. It can be a challenge. Let's move to number 3 for reasons elderly parents won't listen. You are family. And no matter how much experience you have, a parent may still look at you as their 12-year-old child. The other consideration is that there are many factors involved in what might seem like a simple change or a decision that you want your parents to make. Caregivers may not find this out really, though, until something happens. For example, a parent is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and has to check blood sugar and dose insulin. Any new diagnosis like this can feel overwhelming because managing type 1 diabetes also involves managing diet, exercise, staying hydrated, drinking enough fluids, getting enough sleep, and managing the mental stress from seeing high numbers whenever you take a reading. For people with type 1 diabetes interested in technology, using a continuous glucose meter and an insulin pump can be life-changing if one is willing to learn the technology. If you watch TV these days, you probably see commercials about this all the time. People wearing a CGM pump, they take their cell phone, they put it next to it, and they get a reading. Number 4, for reasons elderly parents won't listen, is that children can be so worried and focused on solving parents' problems that this interest, while well-intended, can feel like a parent is being constantly nagged. Have you ever felt nagged by someone to do something? You know how it feels. Nagging can result in avoiding the person or avoiding the subject, which in either case isn't good for caregiving relationships. Caregivers can also have a need to be needed. This is the idea of trying to save everybody in the world by being outer focused. Being a family caregiver is stressful enough without taking on the problems outside of the family or your own personal problems. Consider this. For every piece of advice you give or want to give someone else, give yourself a piece of advice. Make that change yourself for every change or action you suggest that someone else does. Telling people what to do can make you feel like you're being helpful, but it also can really harm your relationship. This leads us to number 5 for why elderly parents won't listen. And it's partly that you may be viewed as being insensitive or non-empathetic to a situation. And let me relate this to an interaction that caregivers tell me about all the time. Caregivers say, Pamela, how do I respond when someone asks how I am and then doesn't want to listen? Well, we have to put this into context. It's essential to realize that a how are you is a pleasantry. It's a greeting. It's part of social conversation. Hey, how are you today? Understanding that the people saying, how are you, if they're not a close friend of yours, they are making polite conversation. They don't really know or want to know how you are, especially if when they say that, you blurt out this long list of problems or you talk about the care situation with elderly parents or a spouse. Sometimes that blurting can be called venting. Now, this all has a time and a place. Usually, in an on-site or online caregiver support group where other people have similar interests and the time to listen and they can empathize. So if you need a place to vent and be heard, I invite you to join my online caregiver support group on Facebook. It's called The Caregiving Trap, and it's named after my book of the same name, The Caregiving Trap. Caregivers from all over the world join in to share stories and support each other. So let's turn around the situation where someone asks how you are. Assume that they have no interest in listening because they don't know you very well, or they can't relate to being a caregiver because they've never had the experience. Translate this. Your mom, dad, or spouse complains about something. They don't feel well today. They expect you to listen. You don't want to listen. It's the reverse. And what happened in your parents' life? Well, maybe you were supposed to show up with groceries and you did, but you forgot the Skippy peanut butter. So mom or dad's world is just crushed and turned upside down. You were trying to do a good deed and yet you get criticized, right? This type of interaction can make anyone feel unappreciated or resentful. You might be thinking, why do I even bother when this is the thanks or the recognition that I get? It doesn't make me feel good. Well, that's the same thing with being on the other end of advice. While you may not be experiencing the problems of your parents, poor health, arthritis, exhaustion, strike that. I know a lot of caregivers who are exhausted. Trouble walking up and down the steps, or maybe grieving the loss of the ability to drive. For a parent, these are life-changing issues that are a big deal. So when you give advice that makes these situations seem minor, unimportant, or easy to work through, your parent may see them very differently. And so they refuse the advice and they become resentful. Resentment between caregivers and care receivers happens in caregiving relationships when both sides don't feel like they are being heard or are comfortable expressing their opinions. This takes us to number 6 for reasons elderly parents won't listen. Do your parents have the cognitive ability to understand the advice, the consequences, or the effect of decisions? If there is a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's, this decision-making may be possible in the early stages, but not possible in the later stages when memory loss becomes quite advanced. In all these situations, you as a caregiver, your mind may grasp information quickly, but a more thorough discussion may be necessary to get your parents on the same page. These discussions can require more patience and time than you feel you have. The critical idea is not to rush the decisions, but to schedule them when you can make the time, and your parent is in a position where they're willing to listen and participate in the conversation. Coming up after the break, solutions for how to respond when elderly parents don't listen. Pay it forward to helping others dealing with health, aging, or caregiving issues by sharing information about this show and my website, PamelaDWilson.com. The Caring Generation is available worldwide on your favorite podcast and music apps, Apple, Spotify, Spreaker, and many others. You can find links to all these on my website. As a caregiver, you don't have to go it alone. Caregiving doesn't have to be a do-it-yourself job. Visit my website, PamelaDWilson.com, to schedule a one-to-one telephone or video consultation with me. All you do is click on How I Help, then Family Caregiver, and then Eldercare Consultation. You can also check out my online caregiver programs, resources, and support page. This is Pamela D. Wilson on The Caring Generation. Stay with me. I'll be right back. This is Pamela D. Wilson, caregiving expert, author, and speaker on The Caring Generation, where there are now over 130 episodes responding to questions from family caregivers. Visit and share my website, PamelaDWilson.com, where you will find my caregiving library, Caring for Aging Parents blog, online caregiver courses, and more. Let's continue our conversation about solutions for reasons elderly parents won't listen. For the rest of the show, I'd like to focus on ideas that might help you find the solutions to working with loved ones to improve or move care situations forward. Number one is gaining an understanding of how your care receiver views the problem, because it's possible that it is very different from you. As a caregiver, it's easy to get into a rut and think that we know everything. But we can't solve the reasons elderly parents won't listen to us unless we truly take the time to listen, be interested, ask questions, and really have a desire to understand. Everybody puts their lives into this context of life experiences, knowledge gained, and interactions with other people. This is why you and a parent or a spouse can have a totally different belief about the same subject and about even how you approach problems. Here's an example. Recently, I had a conversation with a caregiver looking for a care community for a parent. I was asked to make some recommendations, so I did. My suggestions were based on personally visiting the locations, meeting the staff, getting to know everything, and in some cases, I had previous personal experience managing care for a client who actually lived in these communities. So my personal experience in visiting the communities and talking to the staff and doing some research was the basis of my recommendation. Now, in simple terms, I gave the information to the caregiver, and the caregiver only looked at the websites and immediately said that a couple of the communities I recommended were not appropriate because their websites were not as elaborate or detailed as some others. So when you look at this contrast, you can see that perceptions of the communities are based on different factors. And this may be helpful for you if you're looking for a care community for your parent. In this case, I did all the research. I actually visited. I was very thorough. I spent hours, like 16 hours, making these recommendations. And the family caregiver spent 1 hour on the internet. So this is why it's important to understand that a parent or one of your siblings may have a totally different impression than you do based on the criteria they use to evaluate information, whether it be a care community or in-home care agencies or even just an interaction with another person. I can tell you, especially looking at care communities, there are so many factors to consider, and just looking on the internet is not going to give you those answers. A care community that provides wonderful care may not have the most up-to-date website, or you may visit and the building may be 10 years old versus a newly built or remodeled buildings. If it's of any help, these comparisons kind of relate to that old saying that you can't judge a book by its cover. You have to open it up and look through the pages and read the book. We have to add to this idea the emotional mindset of family caregivers who may feel guilty about looking at care communities. So instead of being open-minded, it's easier to say that, the website doesn't look great and I don't want to visit because, the printed materials aren't as fancy or they didn't say this word on the website. It's kind of like giving an excuse not to take action, right? Until you truly visit a community, learn about the community, meet the staff, talk to the residents and some of the families, you're not going to have a good idea of the offerings or whether you feel like you can establish a relationship with the staff and whether they will be caring and attentive. So while visiting multiple communities can be time-consuming, and it can be emotional draining because you may see things you don't want to see, but the goal here is to find a community where your mom or dad or a spouse can live for the rest of their life, hopefully. You don't want to make a rash choice and then learn that you chose the wrong community 1 month or 6 months down the road. That poor choice will be hard on you and even more challenging for your loved one who has to be uprooted and moved a second time. So gaining an understanding of the perspectives, the value system, how your parents and other family members evaluate situations is essential to giving advice and moving everyone forward in the same manner to be on the same page. Number 2 for solutions, to understand that people think differently, process differently, and look at information differently. It's to understand this, and this kind of follows on number 1. So you might be a person who has a lot of experience, and so as a result, you make decisions like, very quickly, come on, let's move on, let's go. Another family member, though, may need a week or several weeks to think about it and decide. So it's the idea of not rushing other people to take your advice or to make a decision once you've done all of this research to show them. This leads us to number 3 for solutions to reasons elderly parents won't listen. They may feel that you think they don't know what has to be done, when really they may know. But the problem is they may not want to do anything today. The difference of opinion related to reasons elderly parents won't listen may simply be a timeline difference. You want it now. Your sense of urgency is now. Let's get it done. Let's move on. I want to get back to my life. But your mom and dad may not be ready. In this case, if you have reasons or facts that confirm why making this decision has to be done now or why it's time sensitive, then present that information. Sometimes, and you may have experienced this, waiting does result in a blessing in disguise. How many times have you maybe waited a day or two to make a decision, or you got delayed and you couldn't get back to it, and then you received new information that was really helpful and allowed you to make a better decision? This idea flows right into solution 4, which is instead of giving advice, doing research and presenting information and alternatives so that you can discuss something without having an outcome that you have to decide at the end of the discussion. It's also creating a thoughtful list of pros and cons and not being stuck on always having things done your way. There may be better ways. Presenting both sides of an option may help you even look at the situation in a way that you didn't previously consider. You may find this a great learning experience that results in better decision-making in all aspects of your life. Imagine if everyone in the family agrees after you present information, instead of fighting or constantly second-guessing about, what should have been done, or we should have done this differently, or why didn't we think about that? We made a mistake. That can be emotionally challenging if you're that primary caregiver. The next 4 solutions to reasons elderly parents won't listen, and this can happen in the beginning stages of caregiving, but also in the latter stages. This is one that really gets caregivers into trouble. You may want to be so helpful that you jump in to save the day because in the early stages of caregiving, this doing is easy for you. Doing and doing and doing is how caregivers become overwhelmed and burned out over time. Maybe for you, not in a year, but in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, you're exhausted. It's as if you take over the life of your parents without involving or asking their opinions or encouraging them to do things on their own. So these actions can actually lead to the opposite of what you want, which are reasons elderly parents won't listen. You have clearly shown through your acts, if you've taken over, that you don't really care what your parents think. In a sense, you have become an over-controlling caregiver that has worked yourself into this caregiving trap. You're doing everything for a parent who you have trained to expect that this is what you will do because you did it and because you gave advice and you expected your parents to follow your directions without objecting. It's interesting when you think about it, isn't it? Caregivers may want to give advice, but when parents listen and follow, this results in parents becoming more dependent on the caregivers because the parents aren't really supported to make their own decisions or to take action. And this type of relationship can lead to failure on both parts. Caregivers can feel like they've given up their lives to care for parents and failed at careers, marriages, raising children, and managing their health because of everything they willingly gave up. Parents can fail in health and mental well-being when children take away their options and choices. Number 5, for solutions to reasons elderly parents won't listen may be the most difficult. Letting others fail and learn on their own when you could prevent this. We've all been there. Learning by trial and error and sometimes having to face hard knocks, but most of us got back up, right? We learn through experience. We gain knowledge by succeeding and failing, but either way, we're better for it because hopefully we learned something. So the next time you want to give advice and are not asked, be silent. Zip it up. Listen and wait for the other person to ask your opinion. Suspend your judgment. Play devil's advocate in your mind. When you don't give your opinion, this is an excellent practice for you to think about options and pros and cons for the time when someone does ask your opinion. Then you'll be prepared to be more balanced and thoughtful rather than just spouting off the first thing they think. Not trying to influence another person's decision, but sharing the pros and cons allows them to choose. It allows them to participate in that decision-making process so that the relationship feels more balanced. Caregivers, I know there are so many reasons elderly parents won't listen, but there are so many solutions if you're willing to change your behaviors and the way that you look at solutions. So I thank you so much for joining me for this program. If you want to share your story or you have a request for a podcast topic, video, or article, visit my website, PamelaDWilson.com, and go to the Contact Me drop-down in the top navigation bar. Then click on Caregiver Survey and complete it. I will get your responses. Please do share the Caring Generation podcast and my website, PamelaDWilson.com, with everyone you know who is interested in proven, reliable tips, information, resources, and research about caregiving, aging, health, and everything in between. This is Pamela D. Wilson, caregiving expert, advocate, and speaker. I look forward to being with you again soon. God bless you all. I'm sending love, positive thoughts, hope to everyone. Sleep well tonight. Have a fabulous day tomorrow and a great week until we are here together again.
Tune in each week for The Caring Generation with host Pamela D. Wilson. Come join the conversation and see how Pamela can provide solutions and peace of mind for everyone. Here on Pamela D. Wilson's The Caring Generation.